Hey folks, this is Trust the Process. My name is Travis Fritz. I'm a brewer in Williamson, Michigan at Old Nation Brewing Company. I've been doing this job for about 20 years, and I'm using this opportunity to chat with folks who are involved in the industry here in Michigan and all over the country. Perspectives on work, on philosophy toward work, and on the brewing industry specifically most of the time. So I'm glad to have everybody join us here today. Also joining us here on the call is Adam Stout, along with John Cole, who is also working at Old Nation Brewing Company. Adam, I am excited to talk to you today, most primarily because I know you are a guy who's been doing this for a long time. You've done it in a couple of different places in the U.S. and then a couple here in Michigan. And I am excited to get into it with you. So I'll start by a little brief introduction. You're kind of born and raised in Colorado.
Yep. Yeah.
Born and raised in Colorado. You had an organic chemistry master's in Colorado?
Fortunately, yes.
Was that at Colorado State or
yeah, CSU and Fort Collins, yeah.
Cool. Excellent. And you did some work in the medical field before this. Can you
biotech, just doing
biotech
research as a medicinal chemist for 6 years or so.
Okay. And that was so phenomenally engrossing that you decided to be a brewer?
That was so exciting. I needed a career change by the end of it. So.
Tell me a little bit about that. You started right out of college in that field, or?
No, I did college, didn't know what to do with a chemistry degree, so I went to graduate school. About 6 months into graduate school, I realized that organic chemistry PhD track was not for me. So got into I just switched to the master side of it, which is everybody enters in the PhD track. So switching to master side is simple. So got out of there, got into industry after that in Boulder, and did 6 years of the roller coaster of having to go on fundraising runs every 3 months because the company is about to run out of money. Oh. So after 6 years of that, it kind of burns you out. So
it was the work around the work mostly.
Yeah. There had been a few times in there too that I had at one point I contacted Oscars and I got offered a job in their QC department. And looking back on it, I should have taken that, but I turned it down at the time. So
why'd you turn it down?
Money. Yeah, you make a lot in biotech, so
I can imagine. Yeah, I guess that's one of the reasons why I'm interested. So what was the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back? Was it the move to Michigan, or?
No, it was we just had a major falling out at the company across the board. Like our chemistry department was pretty close knit. And since we were generating all the IP for the company, we had a lot of say. And there was just kind of a big fallout between the people in charge and the chemistry group, and it went downhill from there. So I had some friends who were interested in opening a brewery, and I somehow convinced them that I kind of knew what I was doing. So they gave me a shoestring budget, and I built a Frankenbrew system and I don't know if you're familiar with Pizza Boy, Colorado.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, he wrote a bunch of books and stuff too. But
yeah,
I read like everything he had, and I was like, oh, I can go buy used farm equipment and slap this together. And
the square dairy tanks.
Oh yeah. Oh, I had all of it. We had the square hot liquor tank, the square mash tun.
Easy to clean.
Oh yeah. And I had a boil kettle that looks like, looking back at it, looks like it should have been a bright tank, but electric elements and stuff in there. So we had 420 pulled down electric into this thing with water surrounding. It was real exciting.
So with a great deal of labor and consternation, you were able to kick out beer.
Oh, right? Yeah, a great deal. So I always joke now, like, you can give me any little piece of crap and I'll figure out a way to make something work. But
yeah. That's what, this was, you get a coconut and cut a hole in the bottom and whatever, in 4 hours you're cooking up beer. This is something I've not said a lot, obviously, but you can make beer out of anything.
Pretty much. Yeah. But then after that, my wife is a physician, but she was doing her fellowship, and she was doing her fellowship at U of M after looking at lots of schools. San Diego was where I was like, go to San Diego. At the time, but their program's not, U of M's like world renowned for endocrinology. So we ended up here.
She's an endocrinologist?
Yeah.
Oh, so she's a smarty pants type.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
So I ended up landing at Roke as the lead brewer with Brandon and Trace, who were running that at the time. And then we all revolved out of there pretty readily. And I ended up here at Aberrant with Clark, and it's been a really good fit. So
yeah. So I mean, we don't know each other very well. We haven't spoken much, but I particularly a couple of years ago was on social media a lot, and that was the vibe that I got from you. I mean, having been around brewers for 20 years and kind of understanding what subtext is when brewers talk about their jobs and what it is that they do. It did seem like you were one of the guys that seems really fulfilled at his gig. Do you feel like that's, I mean, without talking out of school, do you feel like that's more or less true there?
Oh yeah, definitely here. The market out here. If everything were up to me, I'd be doing mixed fermentation all the time, but nobody buys mixed fermentation anymore anywhere, as far as I can tell. So that market's dead. But yeah, no, it's good. I've had a lot of time to really perfect my baby beers, and just do the process as I want to do the process. So
yeah. Well, I mean, tell me a little bit about that. You said your baby beers. I suppose that means those are the ones you make for yourself, and
I mean,
to go out to the pub and sell or whatever.
Yeah, to a degree. Luckily, there are two that actually sell reasonably well. But and I mean, one of them, yeah, Jonathan's holding it up. Our cream ale, that's probably my original baby beer, even though that was not my intent coming in. That was when we started this place. I mean, Clark's a great owner in that he knows what he doesn't know. So that's where I came in. And yes, I know that's a thing that people don't realize until it's too late most of the time.
Well, right.
Yeah. So I came in and we had a lot of discussions revolving around, okay, what do we want to focus on? Where do we want to take this? All that kind of good stuff. And, I mean, he just had kind of a basic list of, hey, these are kind of the flagships I want to focus on. And I was like, cool. Well, did you have any idea of like exactly how you wanted to do it? Because I used to be really hard pushing. I'm going to make it my way, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, I think we
anymore. It's like I want people to buy my product. So
right.
Yeah.
Well, but I think that's kind of where that's the headspace you really mature in, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you build skill by kind of saying, everybody's trying to keep me down. I'm going to do whatever it is that I want to do and nobody can stop me. But then you find that, what stops you is not selling any beer, and you've got to kind of rediscover, right, where it is that you are actually coming from and what is actually important to you. And once you've kind of made peace with the idea that maybe you've got to keep some of these ideas and passions in your pocket for a little while, I think you lose the ego and you start to you start to really improve in ways that you wouldn't if you kept being a punk about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you talked about so this is interesting to me because I've done this a bunch in my career. I know probably every brewer has, right? You get hired by somebody and the first thing you do is you go into the pub and you're like, okay, I mean, obviously you check and see how clean it is and how much work you're going to have to do when you get hired. But after that, what kind of beer are they making? What does the point seem like to this brewer?
Yeah.
So is it like a restaurant and kind of like that early 2000s, late 90s vibe where these still exist, by the way, where it's like red, wheat, light, or cream or whatever. And then what are the others? Pale ale, maybe an IPA, and some dark beer, right? Yeah. And that's it, right? It's like 8 beers on tap and it's a restaurant and you're just a guy that's supporting the restaurant. Or is it, are they trying to be funky? Are they really, I think for me, it is like, are they trying to reach beyond their grasp or not? And if they are, is there anything that I can do to help them get there?
Yeah.
Or is this just too ambitious? How did you feel about it when you went to Aberrant?
Well, the ethos here, because I always lump that into the ethos of a company. And Clark and me, I think we see pretty eye to eye on it. Neither of us like drinking big beers. The sessionable, quaffable, whatever you want to call it, is a high priority. And I like to say I've got Colorado mentality when I come to this. Granted, this is like mid 2010s mentality, so it's a little bit different now in Colorado from what I understand. I'm pre Weld Works, where you had to release a new beer every single week to get anybody.
Like endemic all over now, man.
Yeah, right? I know. So to me, like growing up with, especially when I was in graduate school, I mean, New Belgium at that time, you just walked over, hopped in the pub, and you got 5 free samples.
Right.
There was no lines, there was no waiting. You could go on a tour if you wanted to, but you didn't have to.
Yeah.
And Odell's was pretty much the same thing. Yeah. Even in Fort Collins at that time, I think there were 6 or 7 breweries then. So like Cooper Smith's was the downtown brew pub with a fantastic amber ale and ping pong tables. So I mean, it was very balanced.
Yeah.
That's the term I like to use. Is everything was very balanced at the time. You weren't swinging too hard any one direction. I mean, even the West Coast IPAs and whatnot weren't like they are now. So
well, I mean,
they were.
So what time frame would this be that you're talking about now in Colorado?
This would be about, I graduated college in 2006, I think. So it would have been about 2007 through 2012 would have been my foundational period, I think you could call it. So
sure. Well, I mean, so you touch on a couple of things that I wanted to touch on anyway. So I'm gonna ask you about them. I think there is. I would say during that time period, for sure, there was a huge difference between Colorado breweries and Michigan breweries. I think there is still a pretty big difference, right? Of course, we had the benefit of having Bells and Founders in Michigan. And you all had the benefit of New Belgium, and the list goes on and on.
Yeah.
But Colorado is a more mature beer market. It just is.
Yeah.
You know, the competition doesn't seem to be more intense or less full of camaraderie to whatever extent Michigan's full of camaraderie, but it just seems more mature. I don't know how would you explain it? Do you know what I mean?
I am not sure exactly what propagated it out there. I mean, part of it was that we had like Boulder Brewing Company is one of the oldest breweries in the country. Fort Collins Brewing Company was one of the oldest in the country. So you have a couple of breweries that came on board at the same time Sierra Nevada was like getting started. So you've really got that kind of like homebrew driven crowd getting into it at the time. In terms of jobs and per capita and stuff like that, Colorado is just like sky high. So you've got a lot of insanely smart people who like to brew in their garage around the same time, and then a few breweries pop open, and it just drove the bar sky high for what could survive out there.
Right.
So I think the bar is just higher per se to survival, and I think the same is true of California too. I mean, sure. So when you walk around and you're exploring, it's a pretty safe bet that your random new brewery that's just opened up is actually going to be producing maybe not amazing stuff, but it's probably not going to have flaws. So,
this makes sense to me. And I think, you know, one of the things that we see, and I mean, I'm not trying to make this all about lager, obviously, even though I want to, but one of the things I see in Colorado is obviously there are these relatively successful, at least lager breweries out there.
Mm-hmm.
And they beat us by, 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
For that. So there's an example. I think one of the one of the things I really liked about the craft beer culture in the U.S. In the early 2000s was that there were pretty distinct regional differences. And you could certainly chalk it up to, look, they're just a more mature market. They've had more successful breweries for longer. Or like in Colorado, most of the population is concentrated in pretty much one part of the state.
Yeah.
And, so it's easy to have breweries pretty much right next door to each other on a lineup 25 or whatever. That's a cultural difference, right?
Yeah.
A lot of those things make Colorado different from Michigan.
Yeah.
To me, it seems, and I'm not asking you necessarily to comment to be an expert on this. I'm certainly not, but it seems to me like the consumer has been drinking craft beer for longer, and so they kind of understand better what a good one is, what kind of a mediocre one is, what someone making one that doesn't know what they're doing tastes like. And it reminds me a lot more, frankly, of Europe. I mean, I would say in a weird way, it's more evolved than Central Europe. But so, for example, if you talk to a German, they'll be able to tell you which beer they like and why, right? And they'll be able to tell you, and it's not, well, because my dad drank Budweiser or whatever. It's, I really like this because these are the characteristics that define it and make it appealing to me. But really, that's about Pilsner. And maybe if you get somebody who's way outside the box and doesn't live in Dusseldorf, it might be alt beer, for example, or whatever.
Yeah.
It's pretty much Pilsner. Whereas in Colorado, you have people who they don't even necessarily take pride in it. They're just so steeped in the idea of these different disciplines and these different styles that they're not so much what kind of happened here in Michigan has been happening, all around the country for a long time. You talked about WeldWorks, which is a cool, awesome brewery. But you get these kind of copycat breweries when those breweries pop up. And then the culture kind of dilutes and changes and reorganizes and comes back together. And the last time I was in Colorado was like 3 years ago, maybe. And that is what it felt like.
Yeah.
Felt like, man, this whole thing is reorganizing. They got these lager breweries, and that's great. But a lot of these guys are doing these kind of stunt beers exclusively and to varying degrees of
success. Yeah. It's changed a lot. I mean, it's bizarre to me too. I think one of the foundational things about Colorado was goes back to state laws and the self-distribution cap. I mean, New Belgium was allowed to build their entire company by themselves. They didn't have to bring in a distributor.
100%.
And you see that with Stone, and a lot of the West Coast bigger ones were able to do that too. Whereas Michigan, I don't know the whole history of all the stuff out here, but I know about the time I came out here, it was pretty hampered.
Yeah.
And that makes a huge difference when you're trying to start a small brewery, because you give up a lot of control when you start signing over. So
you do.
Yeah.
And
that is a discussion for a whole
podcast that we can absolutely
series.
Do.
Yeah, I know that's a few days worth of discussion right there.
But I think there are some kind of discrete, important things we can talk about. Within that.
Yeah.
For example, in Colorado, our distributor is a brewer, right? We do the Crooked Stave is our distributor.
Yeah.
So they get it, right? It's not the same as working with a straight up middleman, right?
Yeah.
They really do. Every distributor says they're brand builders and they understand how to do that. What they mean is we will take your brand and, sell it for parts. And, if you make it through all that, then kudos to you, right?
Yeah.
Whereas Crooked Stave will be like, okay, what is it that you're actually trying to do here? You know what I mean? Like, where are you going with this? Which is, to your point, a wonderful thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even if it's not self-distributed, I suppose, to have just that kind of empathy going back and forth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a big difference.
Yeah. So in terms of the culture of brewers in Colorado and the culture of brewers here, and again, you came to Michigan around
2015, I think it was. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Strong guild in Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
Relatively,
basically the foundation of the national guilds.
Absolutely. 100%.
Yeah.
And a guild here in Michigan, which is, strong in some respects and weak in other respects, like most guilds. you attend guild meetings and festivals and all that kind of stuff, or have you kind of? Okay. Without putting you in an awkward position, what do you think? And you can just say I had no comment or whatever, but what do you think kind of are the differences in brewer culture between the two states?
In terms of brewer culture, again, you go back to the maturity of the market. I think that's also reflected somewhat through the way those operate. I mean, Colorado had a lot of very high level discussions going on at their more basic festivals. I mean, you could go to Great American Beer Fest before it turned into a shit show.
It is a shit show.
Yeah, not what it used to be. And there were just great discussions happening.
Yes,
all the time. Yeah, and even the homebrew culture back then. I started homebrewing when nobody knew what brewing a bag was.
Right.
Now that's from what I understand, that's what everybody does anymore.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like we were like, oh, this is so cool, I'm making blah blah blah. It was, hey, how do I make this process better?
There you go.
So everything out there was very much like goal oriented on the back end of it too.
You look for the smartest, most experienced guy that will talk to you and talk to him until he walks away. Pretty much. Yeah.
And it was awesome. Like Dry Dock Brewing out there. I mean, they owned a homebrew shop, so they were super open to anybody who wanted to come in and get knowledge. And granted, again, I mean, this was the boom of craft breweries, the peak of it. So I don't know how reflective that is of current culture out there, but at least when I was getting into the industry side and whatnot, that's, you could go anywhere, talk to anybody. It was extremely collaborative, and usually pretty high level.
So coming from Michigan and, being the son of a machinist and, pretty much just all tradesmen of one sort or another around me, I have noticed a shift away from what you're talking about, which to me sounds like what I came up in as a brewer, mm-hmm. and also saw other tradesmen doing as a child, and has moved into something that is less maybe brewer focused and a little bit more kind of marketing and sales division focused, right? What's easiest to sell?
Easy there.
Whoa.
I'll say it to your face to anybody else. What's easiest to sell? I mean, Lord knows I sell beer a lot too, and I have for decades. But what's easiest to sell is what's novel, right? Mm-hmm. This is where, and if this word makes your skin crawl as much as it makes my skin crawl for the same reason, I apologize. But you don't hear brewers talk about innovating, right? You hear brewers talking about, fucking around or interesting ideas or whatever. But we're not like sitting around going, how can we innovate? You know what I mean? You hear marketing and salespeople and journalists and kind of industry people always talking about, well, if you're going to do this, there needs to be innovation involved. And for them, innovation is last year they used kumquats and this year they're using kiwi, right? In their sour, in their kettle sour or whatever. And to a brewer, to me at least, that sounds like some bullshit, right?
Yeah.
But I do feel like kind of the overall craft culture for me in between about 2009 maybe, but certainly by 2011 until now or just recently, that has been kind of the focus of brewing. And I've noticed that it's kind of pulled newer brewers. It's not cool to just sit around and drink beer with a guy that's way older than you and has done this for a way longer time and just ask him questions about how he cleans a 90 if he can't quite reach it, right? or whatever, which is a really important conversation for any brewer to have, and young brewers. But it's more about how do you guys, how do you guys, where do you get your raspberry puree from? Or whatever.
Or how many sour gummy worms did it take to get the flavor into that?
And look, I mean, I'm not saying that stuff is not cool.
Right.
It just doesn't seem to bear.
So
from a brewer's perspective, it doesn't seem to be talking about it much.
I think an interesting caveat of that, and you I mean, you fall right into this, is that with New England IPAs specifically. So those of us who have actually spent the time to refine the process, figure it out, all that kind of stuff, we kind of understand that medium molecular weight proteins is the key.
Yes, exactly.
Like if you don't have those, you don't have a hazy beer.
Right.
But I feel like we're a teeny tiny community that's actually given a shit enough to dig through and figure that kind of stuff out. When honestly you can just throw whatever New Zealand hop just hit the market into a beer, turn it out, and probably move it within a couple of weeks. So
yeah, I think New England IPAs are a great vehicle to talk about this with. You're right. Is that we get these questions a lot, right? Like, why don't you guys just do what Treehouse or Trillium does and just put out, just use new hops and just keep putting out beers? Which is a totally valid question. We would make a lot of money if we just did that, right?
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't be particularly difficult, and it's something that we've considered, frankly, and we've done. Really, what I'm talking about here is the difference between like a New England IPA and, let's say, Pilsner, right?
Mm-hmm.
Once we had kind of nailed how to make one, then the idea of using new hops just to make money and kind of take people's loot because they would. I don't know, man. Like, it didn't seem, that's not how I was raised making beers, right?
Yeah.
That you nail a style and then that is your version of that style, right? Once you say you nailed it, everybody else likes it. Okay, put it away.
Yeah. What's
the next thing? Or what am I going back to that I had to stop when I was developing this new style, which of course was New England IPA. But it's those styles, I guess, that that brewers keep coming back to, that just itches at you. You're like, man, it was fucking good, but it wasn't quite what I wanted.
Yeah.
And so over the course of years or decades, you just keep coming back to these beers and just tweaking a little bit, right? Or just making it the way that you did and figuring out whether it was you that was the problem, right? And how you were tasting it or the context you were drinking it in. Does that resonate with you at all?
Yeah. So I've always kind of lumped this into new school brewers and old school brewers, and age has nothing to do with it in the way I do it. But I mean, like I said, in Colorado, it was all old school. You were about the process. You were about refinement. You were about perfection. And It was exactly that. You would keep making the same thing over and over and over, and just little incremental changes here and there until you finally got it dialed into exactly how you wanted it and locked it.
Right.
And then you move on to the next one that you need to dial in, and you just it's an iterative process to get it to exactly where you want it. And I've always called that kind of the old school traditional style. And you can talk to people, and like within their first sentence of talking about beer, you can kind of figure out which school they're going to fall into. And the new school is very exploratory, but I feel like we're running out of things to explore. I mean, the yeast world is really interesting, but unfortunately, it's really hard to sell a consumer on the yeast world. I mean, I use Philly sour for our sours in house, and it's Lacinaceae, which is traditionally harvested from bees.
Right.
And I think that's phenomenal and cool, but nobody cares. What's more important is the amount and type of fruit that I added into it during fermentation. So,
right.
The boundary areas, the boundary pushing, I don't know. It's almost like the American market has pushed it so far that now the off the wall crazy idea is to go back to a light beer and make it really good.
We're starting to see that. I mean, I'm seeing that out there. When I was helping you guys out, getting an idea of how to get into distribution for a small town brewery, I was shocked how approachable people were to your cream ale, about how much that came around. Selling lighter beers for a previous brewery I've worked for, was always difficult. And over the last couple of years, I mean, Travis, now I'm out there with your Fritz Lager, and people aren't blinking an eye. They're like, yes, give it to me. Where before they go, how much more than Coors Light is it?
Well, I mean, John,
that question is gone.
Yeah, you know that from 2005 until 2014, I did make a beer with the Sanders Chocolate Company, but outside of that, we were doing all lagers.
Yeah.
When I say all lagers, we were doing like 2 in a round.
Right. You're making a Hell's and an alt beer, and
right. Then we were trying to do we were doing a lagered ale and then a pilsner.
Yeah.
But what I was trying to do was, I really believed in this beer. I spent years and tons of, my own money and my partner's money and all this kind of stuff, just trying to turn people onto this beer. And it was, I had to go in as the brewer into these bars or wherever and, have a bottle out and be like, all right, this is a sample bottle. Try it. The alt beer, for example, this beats the Killian's you have on tap. Drink that beer. And if it doesn't beat Killian's, you don't have to buy it. I'll walk away and I won't come back. Right. And that is the way that it was done back then. But even back then, and we're talking about, still kind of the earlier development of the craft beer industry here in Michigan, where people were more receptive to that stuff. It was like, man, this is craft beer. So anybody that comes in here not for craft beer is not going to drink it. And anybody who comes in here for craft beer is not going to want it because it's not crazy. And back in that time here in Michigan, at least, let's say 2006, 2007, it was the bitterness race and the ABV race, right?
Mm-hmm.
How bitter, how many IBUs, and how high in alcohol content could it be?
Yeah, it's totally, it's been interesting watching that. I started running my first craft focused bar when I was 20 years old, in 2001 in northern Michigan, where no one north of, I don't know, maybe Traverse City had a couple of crafty bars in 2001. You had North Peak there. You had some things going on, right?
Yeah, it did.
But, and really for the first 15 years of my craft beer experience from a bar manager into selling beer, nobody wanted a cream ale or a lager from a Michigan brewery because, that's not the crowd they were going for. If you were a craft beer drinker, you wanted the furthest possible thing from a European or American lager. That's not what you wanted. You didn't seek it. And then you're right. We went through the IBU phase. And then after the IBU phase, we went through the how high of alcohol could we put in it phase. And then we went through the how much barrel character could we get phase. Now you've got in Michigan, I feel, I'm 41 now. Travis, you're right around there. And as we start getting a little bit older, man, I can't sit down and drink 3 2-hearteds because it's just too heavy. It's too heavy for me now. And so I feel like the mature market that came up in my age group, who's now in their 40s, who is now like realizing I need more drinkability. I need more from my beer than just high alcohol and bitterness. I need, that next step. And it's finally getting there. That article from the Free Press that we were mentioned in is fabulous. And it hit a lot of nails on the head. Like people are coming back and maturing as a market and realizing that there is just as much nuance in a European style Pilsner than there is an American style IPA. And that's been a wonderful change in the last couple of years.
Yeah. I'm glad you said drinkability because I've always loved that term. You can poo-poo on Coors as much as you want for introducing that as marketing back in the day, but it's valid. Yeah. It is a valid characteristic. And if you don't have drinkability in your beer, like you're not going to sell it. It's just go anywhere.
That's right. And people shit on big brewers all the time, right? In craft beer, and it's ridiculous, right? Yeah. They are doing exactly what they mean to do, and they are doing it to a degree of accuracy that 95% of craft brewers don't even know exists.
Yep.
Right. Now, do I like it? No, I don't like it. Do I think it's silly that Coors, for example, the only thing I'd shit on them for is putting the color-changing mountains on the bottle? If I grab for a bottle, I pretty much can figure out whether it's cold or not. It's in my hand.
That's just conditioning the world to realize that the colder their beer is, the less of the taste of corn syrup you'll taste. That's
but again, look, we made New England IPA and we told everybody it has to be cold and it has to be fresh. But how different is that really?
Right.
It is different and for different reasons, and we feel much more noble. But ultimately, again, I think, and we don't need to get into this now, but I think the level of precision required to make those beers, Coors is a little bit of a different animal because they're all doing it in one place, right, from one water source. But if you talk about Anheuser-Busch, and they've got 12 or 13 different breweries all over the country with all completely different water sources and staff and some mishmash of equipment, although it's relatively, I mean, that's a huge undertaking. It's a huge
even Coors, that's not necessarily true because they got sued for the banquet beer because they weren't brewing that in Golden.
Really?
Yeah, they were brewing it on the east. I don't remember where they were based out of. It was on the East Coast somewhere, but someone sued them because it wasn't brewed with Rocky Mountain water. And so now they can only brew that out of their Golden facility. But
it's a huge brewery. I mean, isn't it like the biggest single brewery, or was for a long time the biggest single brewery?
We won't even talk about what they did to the water in that river.
That's a gigantic Superfund site. That gorgeous part of the United States is largely ruined, which is terrible. But we don't do that, and that's why we're great, right? In craft beer, we're not big enough to hurt the environment. But
we've got KPIs.
Yeah, that's right. I think when we talk about, and this kind of is just turning back into the conversation we had about Colorado and the development of the consumer's palate and all that kind of stuff. I think it's possible that that's happening in Michigan. I'm not sure that it is yet. And I'm not sure that it ever will, frankly, because a lot of the culture here in Michigan, I mean, I hope it does, and I think it will. But a lot of the culture here in Michigan was built, it seems to me like Colorado pretty much had the 90s. And although there were breweries like Bell's, which started in 1984, I mean, I remember in 1999 at a college party getting Solson, which is now Oberon, and going, oh, this is a thing. There's a brewery here in Michigan. I mean, it wasn't anything like even Odell's was in Colorado in the 90s. So really, Michigan's craft beer culture, with some exceptions, kind of started in the very late 90s, early 2000s. And it really geared toward the kind of beer that Larry was making. And then this legend about Founders, wherever they were trying to do whatever their distributors told them to do, and they were about to close down, and they decided to make a shift and brew what they wanted to make. And out comes Dirty Bastard or Centennial, which are great beers. And so sort of that was the ethic of Michigan brewers. And then Shorts came around in 2006, 2007, and it just became this, like, how are we going to freak out Squares kind of idea,
Yeah.
And Shorts is another brewery like Weldworks that I really respect those guys. I'm friends with them. I think they do interesting and super cool stuff that I don't do. But I think here in Michigan, it became, again, more of, and I think quite early, distributors and salespeople and kind of industry people they saw what Shorts was doing, right? Well, they're coming out with a new beer every 2 weeks, and it's crazy. And some people like it and some people don't, but it's like this long form performance art, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That Shorts.
Well, not to mention their just brilliant advertising that they have behind it. I mean,
their social media arm is incredible.
Yeah.
Yes.
Truly. And just, I mean, from Scott and Joe and the way they work together and their brewing staff and the leadership that's there in the community. I mean, it's what people should strive to make a brewery like that, no matter what kind of beer they're making, without question. But what it ended up making was a bunch of people that were like lawyers or engineers or whatever. And they were like, okay, well, I can do that shit. If these hippies can do it, I can do it too. And then you just get this huge mass of breweries that kind of have very little focus, and they don't really understand the industry, and there's a lot they don't understand. Right? It's not like they have to be part of an old culture or anything. Right. It's just these kind of fundamental things where it's like anybody you talk to, you're like, man, you can do whatever you want. You can be a rock star. You can make any kind of beer you want. But here are these fundamental things that you really need to learn. I say this a lot, and I say it to new guys that are coming up through our system here in Williamston, because what was told to me as an apprentice was by these crusty old German guys who were not, rock and roll cool guys like, American craft brewers are supposed to be. They were conservative. They just weren't plumbers, right? And what they always said was, your first job as a brewer is to not give anyone a hangover they didn't earn, right? And so your first job and that encompasses a ton, right? If you have 10,000 hours to mastery, that might be your first 5,000, right? Because it's how you ferment, what kind of raw materials you select, what your process is. I mean, how your yeast health is ultimately, what controlling pH and all that stuff throughout the process, just to get to that starting point. And then after that, man, go do whatever you want, right?
Yeah, Travis, I think that is a good point when you talk about shorts, is they inspired a lot of small brewers and upstarts to, we need to make a new beer every 3 weeks. We have to always have something new. We have to always push the boundaries. We have to, and what they don't understand is Joe had many years of brewing expertise and technique work before ever opening shorts. He worked with some great people here in the state of Michigan. He had a proper education upbringing of brewing here. And he wasn't just some guy thinking of weird ideas and slapping it in a beer. They had those things, right? Sure. But then they would sit down and say, okay, what's the process to make the base of this beer the best it can be before we start messing around with adding spruce tips and start messing around with adding grapefruit wedges.
Right. And some of those ideas are going to work and some of them aren't, but the fundamental principles of brewing were covered within them, right?
Brewing's deceptively easy. And I think that's kind of an issue, especially in a first world country with lots of money and free time generally for people to do it in their garage. But to get a consistent product is actually way more complicated. And so I've always pushed, like, if you don't understand yeast and you don't understand water, you are not going to be able to do this. Like those are the most absolute fundamental aspects of it. And
at a technical theoretical level and also at a kind of an intimate sensorical level. Yeah.
I mean, God, your beer is 99% water practically. Well, not necessarily 95. 99 would be pretty shitty beer for getting drunk on, but so you've got mostly water in there and your yeast is giving you most of your flavor. If you can't control those two, then how are you going to do this in a consistent way? So.
Yeah, you're right. Well, and I mean, I think, when we talk about what we're really talking about here is, you said, it's deceptively simple to make beer, and I agree. I would maybe go to a different level of nuance and say it's deceptively simple to ferment a grain-based beverage.
Yes, right? That's a better. It's not even grains. It's deceptively simple to ferment something that has sugar in it.
Yeah, you're right. Throw yeast at it and it'll do its job to varying degrees of success.
You don't even need to throw yeast at it. You just stick it out in the rain. Yeah. You'll pick up something.
Yeah, you just skim the scum off every now and then.
Just a couple of things I wanted to talk about and do justice to your employers, Adam, is to obviously bring up Aberrant Ales in Howell, and you guys have been there since 2017. I had the pleasure of helping out over this last summer, just with basically some consulting and having a great time hanging out with you and Clark. It's a beautiful little place in downtown Howell. If you haven't been downtown Howell, it's actually had a lot of growth over the last few years, and Aberrant, I think, is one of those spaces. It's an absolutely gorgeous facility there, which is great. The cream ale, which is I'm drinking right now, is kind of was really, honestly, I've been selling beer for 11 years in the market, and I am excited to say that this beer helped me realize over the last couple of years that people are ready for these styles of beer. They're ready for the light, drinkable, nuanced lager-esque beers. Obviously, cream is nail, which is great. I just saw you guys started launching some cans, so that's cool at the brewery, and we'll make sure we give you a shout out for that. Your can designs are whimsical, and I kind of like them. You got Hazy D and the boys, and the cream ale with the Wu-Tang inspired label. So, you guys like your hip hop and your street art, right? So, pretty cool. Just want to make sure I gave a shout out to those before we get too carried away out there. But how's that canning process going? You've been enjoying having that at your with or not?
Canning.
That's not something brewers enjoy.
Right? Yeah, I'm just curious.
Canning's a blessing and a curse.
Right.
I will say it's better than running the Maheen.
God.
You want to talk about foundational skills? If you haven't run a Maheen, then you don't have the foundational skills yet. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot. You got to know what you're trying to do in order to use a Maheen well, and even then it sucks.
Yeah.
So you got like a cask filler? What do you
got? No, we've got
micro canner?
Micro canner. Yeah, they're based in West Michigan somewhere, okay. But yeah, it's been nice. It's a much more simplified design compared to some of the other ones I was looking at. But to me, that means you can fix it when something goes wrong. So it's been a lot easier than I expected it to be initially. When I was at Roke, we had a Maheen for a while, and then we brought in it's a Czech company. I can't remember what we had, but it was a 28 rotary filler, 28 head rotary, because they still thought glass was like popular.
Yeah.
Yeah, so those were fun. And the canning line by comparison is like pretty smooth.
Yeah. Yeah, right. I mean, we're talking about, whether eating a shit sandwich or shit soup is better, I suppose.
Yeah.
At some point, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's part of the deal, right? You have to learn it, and you have to master it. And starting, I started on, huge, fillers that I wasn't even able to go down and work on as an apprentice or touch really at all. And just operating them and then doing analysis afterwards. And from there, immediately to this is no bullshit, a 1930s juice filler with a labeler. And again, I shit you not, from the 20s. Yeah. This was in the early 2000s.
Love it.
And it was so that, like the labeler, you couldn't get too close to it. You certainly couldn't work on it while it was operating. It would absolutely eat your fingers. Same thing with the filler, right? There was no thought to safety, right?
Yeah.
But beyond that, the principles were largely the same as they are now, right? These machines just are safer and they go faster and they're more efficient.
Yeah.
But that, I think, is what we're talking about when we talk about Maheens and all that kind of stuff. Is the principle, right? The point you're supposed to get to is the same in any of these fillers, right? It's just how much the machine helps you or hinders you from getting there is what you have to learn. And one of the things I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, and this is something that John had brought up on his initial document here, was your perspective on the differences between, kind of a community-based brewery where most of the sales are happening out of the pub to a distributing brewery. And what's interesting to me about that is not necessarily the nuts and bolts of it, although I'm happy to talk to you about that if you want, but more the kind of baked in difference in intent that you have to have as a brewer between the two. And I wonder if that makes sense to you. And if it does, would you speak on it for a minute?
Yeah. I think what you're getting at is kind of the more localized focus gives you a bit more flexibility on what you want to do, what you want to put in cans, and on like how much of the market you're satisfying as well. And the larger you get, and as that ratio of sales swings from taproom to distribution, you've got more like forethought and planning and scalability issues and stuff like that. I mean, bringing on contract brewing to help fulfill some of the demand and opening markets and complying with the laws of shipping across state lines and all the licensing that goes into labeling and all that fun stuff. So they're different worlds. They're just completely different worlds. They function differently. I mean, hopefully you're brewing as nuts and bolts of brewing is the same between them. It's just a size different. But in terms of the way that whole sales machinery and movement machinery and logistics and employment and all that kind of stuff, that's a very big difference between the two. So
it is.
Travis, this is why I told you why I really enjoyed, meeting these guys and getting involved with them, because I feel like they've got a great head on their shoulders between, Adam and their ownership, and they understand, what it's going to take to get to that next level. And it's kind of a crapshoot sometimes whether you will or not get to that next level, even with the best laid plans, but at least understanding the fundamentals of what it takes to go from where they are now to where they want to be is someplace that a lot of places do not have a firm grasp on.
Well, right. And I mean, I think, risk tolerance is a big part of that.
By risk tolerance, you mean how much money do you want to front load?
Yeah. People, I don't gamble at all. And people have asked me a lot, like, well, why don't you? I mean, it's not like I have something against it. I can't. Right. And well, why don't you play poker or whatever? And it's like, dude, I gamble every day. You know what I mean? Like, this is a huge
each contract signed.
Right. This is a huge undertaking that is all risk, right? Any decision that you make is risk. And anything can be, completely. This is one of the things that I'm talking about with the difference between, in my experience, pub brewing and production brewing is the way that people think and talk about beer now has changed pretty fundamentally. With Untapped and Rate Beer and Beer Advocate, and God bless, we do fine on all of those and it's wonderful, but I do it now, but I remember when I started out, the way that you sold beer was by standing behind the bar or sitting at the bar and talking to people about the beer if they wished to talk to you about that. Right? And if they were interested, then you could continue to chew their ear off about all the shit you had to do to get it to where it is in the glass that they're drinking. And there would be a little bit more of a one-to-one, maybe intimate's the wrong word, but I'm not sure that it is, relationship between them and what they were drinking through that. Right. And now, and by the way, these were folks who had largely learned what they knew about craft beer from, Michael Jackson and Charlie Papazian. I'm talking about the beer writer Michael Jackson and Charlie Papazian and Fred, what was his name? Eckhart.
I think,
Listen to your beer. That was Fred Eckhart, I think.
Yeah.
And all this stuff, right? So they were sort of saying, okay, well, this brewer brewed this style, and by the strictures of the style, it is passable or not. And then the extra layer was, and I like it more than other examples of this style or less, right? Which I thought was a functional and relatively nuanced way to taste beer. And I think right at the same time, and maybe for the same reason, that brewers started doing this kind of keep it fresh, keep it sort of novel approach to brewing and kicking out beers all the time, was right around when people shifted from that kind of perspective to this idea of getting online and just drinking a beer and, hot take on this beer is this, and it's there forever. And, that's what it is. And so the way that they tasted them became kind of confined to whatever vocabulary these folks had to talk about beer, right?
Yeah.
So does this beer taste like grapefruits? This beer, hell, it tastes like grapefruits. You know what I mean? It's great. And it's 8%. I love it. 5 bottle caps, right? I like the way that the brewer entered in with the malt and kind of, is supporting that, but not overriding it with bitterness. I mean, all of these kind of more nuanced perspectives didn't get lost. There's still people doing that, but it became way less of the thought leader here. And, it's so nice to be able to drink a beer with someone or talk to them while they're drinking beer and talk about why you did what you did, right? I know that this is a little bitter, for example, but I want it to be a little bit bitter because I know that will reel you into the beer. So without going down a rabbit hole about talking about, Beer Advocate and Untapped and all this kind of stuff.
To plug a future episode, we will have Joseph Tucker, the founder of Rate Beer, on in a future episode. So, Adam, if you want to,
eat him up. There he is.
Can you get everybody to hop on at once and we'll all just hammer it to death?
Hey, thanks a lot, buddy.
Yeah.
No, I'm actually super excited to talk to that guy. Yeah. I'm not even planning on anything, but just kind of figuring out his perspective on the same thing that I'm asking you about, which is
how does that factor into everything?
I mean, pub to production, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't hurt. When I was at a pub, these websites existed, right? And they were, to one degree or another, influential. But they weren't particularly important to me because you're sitting here at the bar and drinking the beer and I'm talking to you, right?
Yeah.
When I'm selling beer to Greece, right, or Denmark, or Colorado or Kentucky or wherever, none of that is under my control, right? So this whole thing becomes about storytelling, essentially. It's sort of a narrative. And this is, well, why is this New England IPA better than another New England IPA? It's like, well, I don't know why we have to tell you, but this is why, right? And that's really much, much, much more complicated than I gave it credit for.
Yeah. Yeah, that brings in a whole new aspect of marketing that wasn't there before.
Right.
Yeah, it's a different world. When you say like rate beer versus Untapped, even those two I find to be completely different animals, because at least rate beer had some guidelines to how you assigned scores to it.
Right. And Beer Advocate as well.
Untapped could be such a amazingly useful tool,
right,
if they would only normalize the data. And I don't know how many times I've sent them emails like asking them, hey, can you guys so within the cream ale category, I love this category because I think we have like a 3.4 or 3.5 in that. But if you pull cream ales across the spectrum, they all fall into that range.
Sure.
Yes.
So for a cream ale, that is actually like really good according to Untapped ratings.
Yeah, that's my favorite thing is like 1.5 stars. This is a really good lager. I don't like lagers.
Yeah. So if they would just go through and kind of enforce some kind of normalization on the data, I think you would see not everything lumping into the same numbers that it always falls into.
Sure.
And B, I think it might actually be probably not terribly representative, but maybe a little bit more representative to the accounts and stuff that are actually factoring that into their decisions. Because I agree, it's a frustrating thing when an account will factor that more heavily than the salesperson who's willing to stand there and drink it with you and kind of tell you the story about it. But it happens, and I understand why. It's a whole lot easier to pull it up on the internet and make a decision based on that than
and it's
the other way.
But that there's some objective democracy happening there, right? I mean, these are people who bought the beer and put it down their neck.
Yeah.
This is what they think about it, right?
Yeah.
Adam, I've had that discussion with buyers where they've said, this only gets a 3.6 rating on this Kolsch. Like, okay, but Google American Kolsch into this thing and see the other top like 20 of them. And the highest rating one is a 3.75 and ours is a 3.68.
Well, and again,
so yes, it's one of the best ones.
Right. That's about these sites rising to preeminence at the same time that this new thought process about a brewing or this natural evolution of American craft brewing happened. And I think this is normal in a lot of emergent kind of, art is maybe a little highfalutin, but like emerging art forms where there has to be a period of exploration, right? I mean, craft beer was inevitable because of the pressure put on the particularly American drinker by the hegemony of these big lager brewers, right? I couldn't now probably tell you the difference between Bud Light and Miller Lite if you put it in front of me, right? Who knows? And I think that was just, again, it was this pressure building and building and building. And finally it was just like, fuck this. There was all these different beers. And we had this first wave of brewers, as you said, kind of get used to things that were from somewhere else and trying to master these different styles. And then once that kind of ran its course, of course, this kind of exploration is going to be the next thing. And they won't go away. There's a time and a place for all of that. But what beer means culturally and how beer is used and all of that stuff, I think are the questions we're entering into now. And it'll be fascinating to see how that turns out.
Yeah.
I think we covered just about everything that we wanted to talk about here.
I got one more thing.
Oh.
I would be remiss with Adam's background as an actually classically trained violin player to not talk about the Free Press quote that you gave and play a little video I prepared. Travis was quoted recently in the Free Press article about the rise of craft lagers as saying the difference between American craft beer and Central European lager is the difference between punk music and classical music. You can do both really well, and both represent a real emotional range for people. But with classical music, if something goes wrong, one little thing, it ruins everything. In a punk band, you can drop your guitar and still keep going. And then our good friend Shane here at Old Nation had made a suggestion, and I made it come to life, Travis. So here it is.
I was on pins and needles, figuring out whether you're gonna let that leak all over your table. That's what I was thinking about most.
You needed a jackboot to just kick it at the end there,
right? Just to kick it across the room. Boom.
Well, I mean, I think that's that makes sense, right? I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it totally, especially with lagers. I mean, lagers. I think there's a misconception with lagers that people think they're the oldest style, blah blah blah.
Oh, no.
And actually, when you look at the history of science in brewing, lagers are still relatively new. But they do, in terms of the refinement, which I think you can lump classical music into classical music and jazz probably same. And jazz may actually be even more so the just pure mental process of what you were doing. So I guess actually I might say lagers fall into the jazz category. They're a newer invention, but totally rooted within the history and the theory of everything that came before it.
Well, yeah. Right, because I mean, Western theory is really the theory that was used in the 18th century by European white guys, right? And jazz is just coming with a broader base of theory, ultimately. Right?
Yeah, pretty much.
So there's just more to know in order to do it. But absolutely, I would say that you're right. And I think, like this is what kind of this podcast is for me, right? Is just to make a record of what this was when it kind of started, right?
Yeah.
And where we all came from as, guys. I've been doing this for 2 decades now. This year marks it for me. In September, that'll be 20 years of not being in school and supporting myself doing this job, my family and the people around me and those people that I employ. And so after 20 years, I thought it would be a good idea to have these conversations, if for no other reason than to have a record of them.
Yeah.
We used to mean it, everybody. But I think people mean it now. And I think a lot of the conversations we're going to have moving forward in this podcast, and I think among the brewing community generally, are going to be about how a lot of the things we're bemoaning as lost aren't really lost. I mean, I'm 42. I'm not going anywhere for another 15 years at least. You're going to, still be kicking around making beer in 15 years probably. I mean, it's still here. So the question then is how to take these, I think from what a modern perspective look like really stodgy opinions about brewing, and how those weave then into, what these third and fourth wave guys are doing. And how do we make it meaningful? And how do we make it not look like a cash grab? And how do we make it not look like gaming the system with Untapped and kind of playing the averages and gambling in that way? But making it something that is clear that we are doing it with intent. We're doing it with heart. We mean it. We've spent our entire lives doing this. And we have tried to be experts in order to do this for people in the best way possible.
Yep.
And that's why I'm glad to have spoken to you today, Adam. Is there anything we didn't cover that you wanted to get to?
Not from my end. I think we hit on pretty much everything. We got to shake our fist and yell at the clouds. So
yeah, and
that's all about, buddy.
Thank you so much for being our first guest, Adam. It was a pleasure interacting with you. You obviously are less than 2 miles from my house. You're not rid of me just because I'm not in there every day poking you. So you'll see me down there. And one more time for Aberrant Ales and Howell, please make sure if you haven't been in there, go check them out.
Absolutely.
They have a wonderful chef and culinary team down there, Chef Brett and his team. If you haven't been in since he's come and revamped that menu, the food's incredible. Travis, do you like hot chicken sandwiches?
I like some of the hot chicken sandwiches that I have had.
Oh, you have got to go have Chef Brett's hot chicken sandwich. It's my favorite.
Is it that wonderfully unnatural red color?
No, I don't.
Crimson.
It's because he uses actual peppers. But
yeah. So there you go. Sold it.
Super good, super tasty, and of course you can find Travis and I in Williamston, Old Nation, pretty much any day of the week.
All right, Adam, man, it has been fantastic. Thank you for joining us on the podcast.
And, thanks for hosting. This was good.
Of course, man. And I imagine we'll probably have you back at some point if you're willing.
Sounds awesome.
All right,
I'm down whenever. So
Awesome. Thanks again.
Appreciate
Cheers.
All right, later. To get different perspectives on work, on philosophy toward work, and on the brewing industry specifically.
If everything were up to me, I'd be doing mixed fermentation all the time.
But
You would keep making the same thing over and over and over, and just little incremental changes here and there until you finally got it dialed into exactly how you wanted it and locked it.
Right.
We kind of understand that medium molecular weight proteins is the key.
Yes, exactly. Your first job as a brewer is to not give anyone a hangover they didn't earn.